Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 19th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maya Changseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at Oxford. These seminars in CIE are jointly organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. Before introducing our prominent speaker, Ricardo Sabates, let me attend to a few administrative points. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online in due course. We only record the first half of the webinar, the presentation itself. We won't be recording the Q&A session. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or to ask a question. If you want to ask a question or to share your comments, your thoughts, please use the chat function and write out your question, at least a brief sentence there. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, I will invite you to ask it yourself. When I invite you to ask your question or to share your comment, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Okay, so let me introduce today's speaker, Professor Ricardo Sabates. Ricardo is Professor in Education and International Development at the University of Cambridge at the Faculty of Education. He is economist by training and has a PhD in Development Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ricardo's area of research focuses on educational inequalities in access and learning, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. His work has been influential in understanding inequality patterns in educational access, second chance opportunities in education for marginalized children, and accountability for education in India. Ricardo has collaborated with numerous international agencies, including UNICEF, OECD, UNESCO, DFID, and the World Bank. He is at Cambridge at the Faculty of Education, a member of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Center and the Cambridge Network for Disability and Education Research. I'm really delighted to have Ricardo here with us today. His talk is titled Understanding Dynamic Influences of Educational Reform in Ethiopia. Without further ado, I will now pass over to our speaker.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you, everybody. It's lovely to see so many friendly faces here. So thank you for joining. Let me now share my screen, which we practiced several times. So I hope this will work without any difficulties. So Maya, yes, I can see.
It's perfect.
Okay. So thank you very much for lovely introduction. And I think the introduction speaks about the fact that this work that I'm presenting here is not just one knowledge, it's many knowledges. And it's many people that really come and have been influential into the work that I do that help to put together some of the thoughts that I'm going to provide here. So today I'm going to discuss the findings that we have in educational reform in Ethiopia. But it's very important that I start first with a disclosure. And the disclosure is really to say that what I'm presenting today is not to put one methodology over another, but many of you who know me know that I'm a quantitative researcher. So I will be drawing mostly on quantitative evidence from the RISE Ethiopia. That doesn't mean that it's all the evidence that the RISE Ethiopia team has put forward. And therefore, it is very important that you know that that's the approach that I'm taking. I will share the experience. I will reflect on the challenges, maybe highlight some of the lessons. And as I previously mentioned, this has been a collaborative approach. This is really a team effort, and I will be acknowledging all my team members at the end of this presentation, for whom I'm absolutely grateful for all the lessons that they have shared with me. And I will hope to learn from you, from the audience, and I hope that you will engage in questioning so that we can continue to move the field forward in a collaborative way. So now moving into the RISE, or Research in Improving Systems of Education program. So I'm part of the RISE Ethiopia team, a team that was put together, led by Professor Tasu Woldehana from Addis Ababa University, the current president of Addis Ababa University, and a number of team members that I will mention at the end of my presentation. And our aim has been really to identify how the nationwide education quality reform in Ethiopia was designed, how it was implemented, and especially with a focus on improved learning outcomes and equitable learning outcomes. As you can imagine, when we started this program of work in 2017, that was when we got the news that we got this project. Later on, we got also affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and other events that had happened in Ethiopia. So we actually also changed some of the design and the focus of our work to be able to support the government of Ethiopia with the evidence that was provided or required given the circumstances. So the focus of the research is really about thinking about the education system and the reform in a more systemic approach. As we work under the RISE program, and this is the global program led by Professor Lam Pritchett, who at the moment is with you at Oxford, and his framework, we have been able to use political economy, sociocultural context as important determinants of policy reform. And I would say that the RISE Ethiopia program has been influential in enabling how, or in enhancing the knowledge that is generated by the global RISE program. But again, it's just one part of the many researchers that have been working on RISE global program who have also been feeding into the thinking about the research in systems of education. So for our work, we primarily try to focus on changes in learning over an academic year, and if possible, look at whether these changes happen over a period of time. So I know this slide is relatively small, but I thought that what is innovative of our approach is the fact that, first of all, we focus on the real life experience of a reform rather than just an individual set of interventions. So this is a very comprehensive educational reform. And therefore, we thought that it is important to focus on this reform rather than let's just focus on one particular aspect of the intervention. We also tried to look at this reform longitudinally or over time, and then we track the evolution of some of the trends. And today in my presentation, I will focus on some of the findings that we have from this line of work. But also we involve the government as key stakeholders and the donors. We also apply multitude of methods. We had a number of interviews and focus groups that were undertaken, as well as case studies that were embedded to capture much deeper issues around the process of reform implementation. Again, all this work is very important, but my strengths are in the quantitative side, and that's the aspect of the RISE Ethiopia that I have been leading. So therefore, I will be reflecting more on that side. But also it is important to mention that we had to be flexible to issues to do with how COVID affected the educational reform, as well as the conflict that happened in Ethiopia a couple of years ago that continued to affect the way that education is implemented and enacted in schools. So let's talk a little bit about this educational reform. It's known as the General Education Quality Improvement Program, or GEQIP. So whenever I say GEQIP is this program, it started by the government of Ethiopia, implemented in 2008. And what is important here to mention is that it has had a continuity. It was designed to be linked to improving learning and learning environments and learning outcomes, and importantly was designed with the aims of national development and human capital thinking. So the thinking behind this reform comes from human capital and economic development. But also it focused first on issues to do primarily in the first phase with inputs to education. They realized that, okay, we needed to have better inputs to education. For this, we needed to make sure that textbooks are created in the languages that are required, that access was an issue. So it was on building schools, refurbishing schools, accessing education. So it was mostly issues that will improve educational access. Not to say that quality wasn't important. It was an important component, but was mostly focusing on inputs. It reached the second phase in 2013 and 18, and the focus changed. They thought it was important to now focus on quality and teaching processes. So there was a huge push towards teacher professional development, teacher knowledge, content knowledge, pedagogies, and that's the main aim of the second part of the reform. From 2019 and continuously, then GEQIP is called GEQIP E for equity. And then the focus is more on equity, particularly focusing on girls, pastoralist communities, children with disabilities, and those from emerging regions. Now, what is important to understand is that this package of reform doesn't mean that there's no more textbooks or the school is not receiving the school grant. No, there is a school grants. It's a continuous process. There is still textbook delivery to the school. So there are still inputs coming into the school. There's still teacher professional development, but they try to have a specific focus and a specific shift. So those resources are invested more for equity purposes. So it is important to understand that this is not just one individual reform that says, okay, we forget about everything that we have done before, and now we're going to do something new. So it is really important to consider this package of reform as continuous support that the education system is providing to schools. So what do we have? Some of the observed resources that we have from the literature in Ethiopia and that is being published in reports is that actually access to educational resources such as textbooks and trained teachers in general has improved, as well as information technology in schools. The numbers of trained teachers is increased and it continues to go up. There's been a remarkable increase in pre-primary and primary education. I saw here that Janice Kim is here, who was working on issues to do with the important improvement in pre-primary education in Ethiopia. And I think it just moved really from the order of 30% in about a decade ago, and now it's hitting about 65, 75%, depending on the data sets that you use. So there's been a huge enrollment in pre-primary education. And obviously all these children are now continuing to feed into primary education and beyond. And it's been, again, depending on the data and how it's looked, there seems to be an increment in the enrollment rate of children with special needs or disabilities. However, there's something here in the story that actually doesn't seem to be telling this story of potentially more inputs into education with learning outcomes. So if I move to the information from the national learning assessments, you can see here the learning outcomes in Ethiopia for grades 4 and 8, and this is just based on national data that is being provided by our colleagues from Addis Ababa University. You can see that if any, results are probably stagnant or potentially going down. So you have grade 4 students achieving 41% in the national learning assessment in 2000, and about 35, 41% during the latest period of time that we have on this assessment, 2020. Similarly, if you look at what is happening with early grades or with other types of assessment, let's use EGRA, the early grade reading assessment, you can also see some decreasing trends. I will make a warning. The first graph that I will show you shows an increasing, because that's going to be on 0 score. So a 0 score is a child that is unable to really answer anything on the test. It just got 0. And the next graph, I will show some decreasing trends. So here we have EGRA results, 2014, 2021, and then what you can see, this is the proportion achieving 0 score. And for grade 2, 50% in 2014, half of them were unable to do this oral reading fluency test, 0. Whereas by 2021, it just moved to 67%, which is quite worrying. There is, if any, an increasing trend. Things are getting worse. If you look at students with limited reading skills, you see kind of the same trend. Now the trend is really going down. Again, 30%, 25% of, depending on what you see. If you see grade 2 with a blue line, 25% of grade 2 children just having limited reading skills. And that is somehow deteriorating. And all of these come with dimensions of equity. There seems to be some dimensions of equity that are coming with some male students outperforming female students consistently throughout the years that there's information. There is increasing gaps based on socioeconomic background, disability status, as well as region. So this gives us a puzzle that we have within our RISE program. So the GEQIP reform demonstrates the government of Ethiopia's strong commitment to education, like really strong commitment. There is a reform, it's working, it's been, implemented, it's been continuous. The focus is not just on inputs, they're focusing on quality, they're focusing on equity. I mean, they seem to be touching on the right parameters that you might think should be aspects of educational reform. But learning outcomes remain, at best, stagnant. They haven't moved. So the aim of this session, and with the support of all the RISE team, we try to provide some of the main insights that we gain from our research in terms of the potential issues that may be behind this particular puzzle that we have. What is behind this, the educational reform, and what seems to be working? So in doing so, I want to take you through 2 periods of time that we have in RISE. The first one is looking back at the period of 2012 to 2018. And this is really the period of the second phase of GEQIP. And we are able to do this because as researchers, we collaborated with colleagues who were involved in the Young Lives study. And we were able to use some of the Young Lives schools and the Young Lives data to understand the situation in 2012. And we were able to replicate using similar indicators in 2018 as part of RISE. So this allows you to see some of the changes that happened in these schools between 2012 and 2018. So as I said, primarily, I will be drawing on the quantitative evidence on the project. And it is important that we're able to collaborate with Young Lives to accumulate knowledge in terms of the knowledge that is already produced in Ethiopia, for Ethiopia, and we're able to then provide more knowledge that can help us make this connection. Looking in between Young Lives school survey in 2020 and our RISE survey, we have around 33 schools that are the same. So 33 out of 90 in the RISE, in the Young Lives, that's about a third. And these 33 schools out of 166 in our RISE. So obviously we all have different aims and needs, and that's why we couldn't just use the whole Young Lives and replicate, because there were different needs and purposes. But 33 schools is very important. And most of the findings that we have, we sometimes use the common schools to see what is happening, and sometimes we use the totality of the schools. For the sake of this presentation, I won't be differentiating to that fine grain because the results in general hold in both cases. The focus again is using grade for pupils because that's the information that we have in both surveys, and is using numeracy as learning outcome. And again, this is not to say that other learning outcomes are not important. There is a lot of issues with comparability across literacy in the 7 languages that we use in Young Lives and in RISE. And therefore, it's a little bit more straightforward. I'm not saying it's totally comparable across all the languages, but numeracy help us somehow to deal with these issues. And we capture some of these trends by using information given by the head teachers. The head teachers really saying how their schools have changed. We then capture information from the teachers in terms of maybe their qualifications, number of years of experience, as well as their content knowledge in numeracy or mathematics. And finally, we also have information on the socioeconomic background of the children in both samples. So what do we find? So what we found is that relative to the children who were in the Young Lives, the children in our RISE data, they actually tend to be slightly older, which is an indication potentially of overage in school, which previously we have seen that overage in school is an indicator of disadvantage. So partly we're capturing relatively older kids, little higher proportion of boys in our data as a difference, but really coming from relatively poorer families and families where the caregiver was illiterate. So the changes, the socioeconomic composition is significant different. And what is interesting is that taking only these 33 common schools, we found a similar pattern. Now, these are 33 schools in the same location. These are the same schools. There's not a really long period of time, but we have seen this very important cohort composition where relatively poorer families are using the government schools. And that's something that I forgot to mention. These are government schools. So there might be potentially some movement of children away from government schools into private schools. There's not many in Ethiopia in these areas, but there's certainly a socioeconomic composition. Learners tend to be more diverse for teaching in the RISE data than what you have in Young Lives. And that's just within 6 years. And if you look at the teachers tend to be better prepared. Look at the higher levels of qualifications. 89% of the teachers in the RISE data in 2018, they have a degree. 6 years earlier, only 61%. So clearly there's been some movement in terms of qualifications. There's also some movement in terms of having a specialization. 57% in the RISE data in 2018 had a math specialization relative to 49%. Some of you may think, oh, but they have less experience. Yeah, but early career researchers are amazing, as I was talking to Maya before coming into the conversation. So it's amazing to have early career, teachers here coming into the teaching with new ideas and new technologies and new pedagogy. So potentially it might not be about something that we can immediately say that is negatively related to learning. And interesting in terms of content knowledge, you can see in this graph that there is an improvement in content knowledge. By using a very similar maths content knowledge for the teacher in RISE and Young Lives, the dotted green line, you can see that is completely moved towards the right-hand side, indicating that the teachers in the RISE, they do know more their content knowledge in mathematics relative to similar or teachers in these schools 6 years before. So again, this is important to highlight as improvements. And with respect to the head teachers, you see very similar situations. The head teachers tend to now have higher levels of qualifications. The head teachers now, 65% have a degree in 2018. 6 years before, 37 in these schools had a degree. So again, these are some of the important issues with respect to really the people, the teachers, the content knowledge, the head teachers, but somehow in the infrastructure and the inputs, we see very different results. This is really interesting. Because in 2018, we saw fewer proportion of children who own their maths textbooks. I mean, we had 46% in the RISE data relative to 81% in Young Lives, which is okay. Wow, this is something that is telling us about these dynamic changes of the reform and is, getting deep in the puzzle that we're trying to understand. There are fewer working toilets. There's similar access to functional libraries, similar access to internet. The average class size is a little bit higher, so more pupils per teachers. But the overall quality of infrastructure, if we put it in an index, it's less quality of infrastructure, if you allow me to say something about quality of infrastructure in the RISE data relative to Young Lives, so in 6 years. But how is this translated into learning? And here we really try to decompose this learning, the more that we can. So we administered the math tests to grade for students using multiple choice, using 13 common items that we have in Young Lives and in RISE. And each of these exams had about 25 items. We use item response theory, we put the mean and the standard deviation. And what you have here is that on the level, the children in the 2018 academic year are performing at a lower level than the children in the Young Lives in 2012. And this tallies with the information on the national picture. The national picture shows either no improvement or, if anything, is going down. But the value added in one academic year is actually higher. And not only the value added here, what you can see from the left-hand side and the blue line is 31 points on value added for the children in Young Lives and 36 points for the children in the RISE. So in one academic year, there's relatively faster, a little bit faster improvement in that learning based on this test. But what is more important is the equity side of this, which was really throwing us when we were looking at these issues. Because if you look at the red line, which is your urban schools, relative advantage, better schools, the value added simply is not much higher on average. But if you look at rural areas, where a lot of the efforts have been in terms of improving, the value added in 2012 was 23 points. The value added in RISE 2018 is 33 points. So that's a significant learning progress with some sort of equitable angle that we now are exploring. So what is related to that learning outcome in our results? So exploring further these key findings, what we found are two very important issues here. The first one is that teacher content knowledge was by far the most consistent and positively associated factor with the progress in mathematics in 2018 relative to 2012. So it was one of the most important predictors, math teachers' content knowledge. And also we found that weaker students, so those that were scoring at the lower end of the distribution, they benefited relatively more by having a teacher who was knowledgeable. So not only the math teachers matters, but also because they know their subject and they're working with weaker students, they're able to help these weaker students more. And similar findings we have when these are for either socioeconomic status or rurality. Now, obviously, these are all confounded. We know very important intersectionalities. Students that are at the bottom of the skill distribution, they come from poorer families. They're also more likely to be in remote rural areas. So how do we get disentangle these is something that we're still exploring, and I yet do not have an answer. But the direction of travel is interesting, that actually this reform seems to have some equitable important equitable angles. So pausing that reform and now showing you the second part of this reform. Now let's focus on this dynamic, understanding the dynamic change 2018 and 2022. So now we have, yes, a period of the new reform, the GEQIP reform, the GEQIP-E reform now. But we all know, because we were in this medium of Zoom interacting with each other 24/7, because we were all in the pandemic. So 2020, 2021, the school closures, and also some of you are aware, we had the Tigray conflict and civil unrest in Ethiopia during 2021/2022. So again, this reform is really confounded with very important international as well as national events. So because of these events, although we started with 166 schools, we couldn't go to 166 schools because the schools in conflict areas where we were unable to go and collect data. Some of these schools were closed, some of these schools it was not safe for our colleagues. And here we were completely guided by the safety across the whole program and what was really important to do for the safety of participants, enumerators, and researchers. So it's not possible to collect, it wasn't possible to collect data. But nonetheless, we have 76 common schools. We have information in the academic year 2018, as I show, and then 2021-22, so very recently. So we're able to see what is going on in these schools, and again, also focusing on aspects of the GEQIP-E reform. So the GEQIP-E reform, as well as being, continuing with the distribution of textbooks and school grants and other aspects of the reform, they also focus on issues to do with internal efficiency. So they really focus on increased enrollment at early childhood, teacher quality, improving teaching quality through teacher professional development, very important in the schools. They have special programs. They also have targeted interventions for girls, children with disabilities, and children from pastoralist communities, as well as education management and information systems. And because of the nature of our research, we are then researching at the same time as this reform is taking place. We're able to have some indicators in our dataset that enables us to see whether some of these areas of GEQIP are changing in this period of time, which we're able to investigate. So what about the internal efficiency? Internal efficiency seems to be working. Overall, our data shows that early childhood continues to go up. There's no indication that preschool enrollment is declining. And at the same time, we found that dropout is declining between the 2018 and 2022 academic years. However, difference with respect to what is called the focus area of quality seems to be a little bit more of a mixed picture here, because there's been a decline in the proportion of schools that mentioned that they have school improvement plans. They also said that the grant was not on time. The proportion of a school grant arriving on time, they said, we're not getting it on time. But the awareness of the head teachers on the reform is improved. But the visitors from the supervisors to the schools decline. So here you have some aspects of the reform. You can say, well, there's a pandemic, it's more difficult, they're recovering, there's obviously still a time of crisis and conflict. So you can see many aspects of this reform moving in opposite directions. The difference related to equity is very similar. The girls clubs decline. 96% in the 2018 were starting, there had some girl clubs going on, and they declined to 84. This is using 76 common schools. So there's actually a decline there. The access to toilet facilities remained relatively high, similar level of latrines by gender. there's decline of disability-related plans, but actually more schools with wheelchair ramps. So increased. And I wouldn't be very comfortable talking so deeply about pastoralist communities because our research was not focused on pastoralist communities. But the small information that we have on the data really indicates that it's limited in both periods. But I wouldn't say with certainty because we have a much more focus on issues to do with girls as well as disability because the team had those expertise. We did not have the expertise on pastoralists within the team. So what we do is we look at these different indicators of the reform, and we see whether these indicators are associated somehow with improvements in value added or improvements during one academic year. And we take this one academic year with the numeracy test scores between the start at the end of the 2021-2022 academic year. And consistently what we find is that most of these indicators related to the GEQIP-E, if they improve or if they move in the direction, then they move in the direction also of value added or improvement in one academic year. So for example, the schools where principals are indicated that they're aware of the GEQIP-E, so when there's an improving awareness, there's also more likely to be improvement in one academic year. When there's been continuous professional development activities for teachers, there's been improvements in value added. When there's been visiting by supervisors, there's also higher value added. I shouldn't say improvements in value added, they should, it's only the value added is higher in those schools. And another number of indicators that we created with some indices, such as a training index, so how much training is in the school, the more training happens in these schools, is associated with value added, higher value added in these schools. The more gender equity aspects there are in these schools, the more value added in these schools, as well as issues to do with the special needs in the schools. So in general, what we see is that the positive aspects of the responses from the head teachers on different aspects of the reform in those schools, there is more value added. Again, there is confounding here between, is this the best schools and therefore that's why the head teachers are, and is because they are the best schools rather than the schools with the implementation. But at the same time, it seems that these are the schools where the implementation is happening, and we're still working on this because we just got the data sets about 7 months ago, the final round of data. So this is still something that we hope to explore further. But let me just throw you into some overall conclusions. Now we have these 2 periods of time. First period, second period, there's COVID, there's conflict, and there is a puzzle that learning outcomes doesn't seem to be moving too much, at least in the national picture. And I hope that what we're bringing is that actually there is important evidence that the improvements in educational access of the reform. And I think this is done not just by us and Janice, who's here in the audience, and many researchers working in pre-primary education in Ethiopia. This is something that is well documented. And what we also have well documented is that there's now more heterogeneity in that we have heterogeneity in reform implementation. Some things seems to be working really well. We have good indicators of teacher knowledge improving, teacher qualifications improving, but at the same time, there are other inputs that doesn't seem to be really working as well or implemented as well in all the schools. But also the schools are becoming more diverse. So as you move to an elite system, from an elite system to a mass system, if you imagine your preschools 10 years ago, having only 30% of the population and now having 70% of the population, that's clearly a huge cohort composition on the number of and the different children that you have here. And any teacher will know that this diversity is something incredibly difficult and challenging for the teachers. And what is interesting from our research is that the teachers are becoming more prepared and having better content knowledge. So the reconciling of this paradox is that the GEQIP reform that underpins the improvements may be working on changing the composition, because GEQIP, by having more schools and having a boost, an incentive for people to send their kids to school and putting more prepared teachers in the school, are having more children into these schools. And they're also improving the amount of learning that is taking place in these schools. But these are children that potentially are first there. Well, we have evidence to suggest that they're coming from poorer families. They're first generation learners. And actually, the important finding is that the weaker, poorer students, more disadvantaged, are the ones that are being supported by the teachers. Now, continuity of the reform is important. What we really require is to understand more about which aspects of the reform are really working and should be enhanced so that they can continue to improve learning. So I think I'm just coming to the time that I've been given. I want to thank the audience, but if they give me time first to absolutely thank my amazing teams here from the RISE Ethiopia, the team, as well as the international team, as well as a number of researchers here who have done an absolutely amazing job. And we wouldn't be able to do anything without Anita, who was our amazing administrator during all this time, and for whom, this kind of knowledge would not be produced, as well as thanking our funders who enabled us to undertake this research. So I think that's the end of my presentation, Maya, and just tell me if you would like me to stop sharing, and I'll be very glad to answer any questions.